All right, welcome back to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. Today we are talking about the Dallas Stars, and Dallas is one of those teams that's been hovering around that playoff or the Stanley Cup bubble for the last couple of years now, and it seems like they just can't quite get over the hump. I mean, they had the Stanley Cup final appearance in the bubble, and ever since then they've been, one of those top contenders, a team that, everybody's had in their top three or four teams, and every year they just seem to come up just a little bit short, regardless of what the situation is, whether it's a bad first round matchup or injuries or whatever the case may be. And this is a team that suffered some pretty significant losses this summer. And I guess we'll start with those. The biggest one being Joe Pavelski. And if you've been following me for any length of time, you know how much I love Joe Pavelski. And I've been a Joe Pavelski fan for basically forever. I mean, I think he was one of the most underrated players in the 2010s with San Jose, and then obviously uh, through the 2020s, especially when he went to Dallas, he was just an unreal player. Both from a micro and a macro stat perspective, he has been one of the best players in the NHL. And losing Pavelski really hurts this offense, and it really hurts what was the best first line in the NHL the last couple of years. Um, and that's going to be a big question mark: is who fills that right wing spot on that top line. The other loss is Ty Dellandrea, Smith, and Radek Faxa. They bring in Colin Blackwell, but this group is easily downgraded. I mean, they didn't replace Pavelski externally. They're hoping somebody internally can step up and take that role. But at least from an outward offseason move perspective, this group is significantly downgraded, and I don't think there's been much pushback on that, to be honest with you. Defensively, I have them at slightly downgraded. They lose Chris Tanev, who again wasn't on this team for very long. Johnny Hockenpah and Ryan Suter. They bring in Dumba. They bring in Brendan Smith. They bring in Eli Labushkin. Eli Labushkin's not very good. He really hasn't been for some time now. Smith and Hockenpah are more or less a wash, and then I think Suter is slightly better than Dumba. And then of course you lose Tanev, who again wasn't there for very long. That's why it's just slightly downgraded, but it's fine. It should probably work out to be about a wash by the end of the year because Suter's probably going to regress from where he is now anyway. And in net, they bring in Casey DeSmith. They lose Scott Wedgwood. That's slightly upgraded for me. I like DeSmith as backup. I think he's slightly more consistent than Scott Wedgwood. And yes, I talked about Wedgwood not that long ago. So there you go. Well, jumping into this offense, obviously you have your big two and Jason Robertson and Rupe Hintz, and those are the two that are going to have to carry this team again. And Dallas's transition from the Sagan Ben era to the Robertson Hintz era has been extremely flawless. Like they haven't skipped a beat throughout that whole process. And I have them tied for the sixth best offense in the NHL. So I don't want to like they lose Pavelski, who would have been an A probably as well. And they're still the sixth best offense in the NHL. And they didn't bring anybody to replace them, which tells you where this offense was. I mean, they were probably going to be close to number one going into the season if Pavelski would have stayed. It really tells you how deep this team was offensively. And although I think that's a pretty significant loss, I don't think it's going to hinder them from being in that championship window basically at all. Um, and the reason for that is because of everybody else surrounding those two. I mean, Jason Robertson, there's not a whole lot to say about him. He's just been phenomenal since he stepped into the NHL. And Rupe Hintz, I feel I might get some pushback on the A for Rupe Hintz, but he's been one of the best two-way players in the NHL the last couple of years. And he's been the guard leader on this team, actually, besides Pavelski, over that span. Like he's been really strong. I think he finished eighth last year in goals to replacement. The point totals aren't quite there, but everything else is there. And that's why he gets into the A category because like all his micros are just phenomenal. So the points aren't quite there yet, but they don't have to be. You can be a great player and put up 70 points. So that Ruben's is the perfect example of that. Other than that, like this team is filled with young talent. Obviously, you have Logan Stankoven, who everybody's excited about. I mean, he's looked great so far in the preseason. And Wyatt Johnson, right? Like those are kind of the next wave of guys, and they're kind of hoping that Stankoven and Johnson can be the Ben Sagan or the Robertson Hintz, right? Like if you can kind of move those guys up into the lineup and you can keep kind of filtering through these other players, like Dallas is in a really good spot. If you can keep kind of pumping out these dynamic duos. And of course, you have Sagan and Ben there too, who are still very serviceable top six forwards, right? Like now they've taken a step back from where they were, 4 or 5 years ago, obviously. But Sagan and Ben are still very serviceable. And you have all this excitement with all these young players, and obviously Wyatt Johnson is kind of the front runner of that youth movement here on this team. But this offense just supplemented with other great players that I really like. I mean, Logan Stankoven, of course, just hasn't played enough to get higher rating than where he is. But he's somebody who I'd expect to shoot up by the end of the season. But then you have like Mason Marchment and Matt Duchene, who are like two of the best third liners in the NHL and guys that I absolutely love. I mean, Mason Marchment's been somebody I've been in love with forever. He was fantastic when he was playing in Florida, and he's been fantastic ever since. He's kind of your prototypical middle six kind of guy. He's in that Oliver Bjorkstrand kind of type of player. And then Matt Duchene is again just another player who time just doesn't seem to age with. Or he just seems to be beating time, very much in a Joe Pavelski type of light. And, for a third line center, Matt Duchene is like, it's fantastic player to have there. Maverick Bork's another interesting player. He's another one of those youth movement guys who I'd be looking at to have a pretty big breakout season. If he does end up playing with Marchment and Duchene, he's going to get a lot of shelter from those two players, and that's going to help him. And then, you have Evgeny Dadonov, who, can be an offensive kind of role player. He's kind of a plug-in, kind of a guy you can just throw into, offensive situations. You don't really want to trust him with a lot of stuff. He's kind of a specialist gadget player. Sam Steele is a fine, fourth line center. And then you have Colin Blackwell, who a couple of years ago was one of the better fourth line players in the NHL. He's kind of fell off a little bit. Maybe he can, find some resurgence in Dallas. But again, even like as far as D minus players go, Colin Blackwell is one of the better ones out there. Like I trust him to kind of bounce back a little bit, especially if he can play in a very sheltered system. And I mean, overall, like this offense is just loaded with players. I mean, really three of these lines have top six offense written all over them. The fourth line is fine. Like it's not anything world beating, but it's definitely a above average fourth line in the NHL. So really the biggest concern, I guess, for this offense is just development, right? Like it's just making sure that guys like Wyatt Johnson and Logan Stamkoven and Maverick Bork can take that next step. And if they can, like this team moves from tied for sixth to like second or first in the NHL in terms of offense. Like I wouldn't be shocked if by the end of the year, and we're talking about this team next year, they're ranked number one because all those guys, those three players who I'm pretty high on all three of them continue to develop, right? If we're talking about, Wyatt Johnson as an A minus player, we're talking about Stankoven and Bork as Bs even. And then that's assuming, Ben and Sagan continue to play at their level. It's assuming that, you can get some stuff out of Matt Duchene as production wise on that third line. But overall, like this team's loaded with guys that I really like that I think can play, 200-foot games. Aside from like Dadonov, there's really nobody on here that I'm super worried about as, a defensive liability. Maybe Tyler Sagan, I guess, in the top six, but even him, he's not like, Mark Scheifele or Kyle Connor levels of, terribly defensively. Dadonov's kind of the only guy I'm a little concerned about defensively, but I mean, he's on the fourth line, he's never going to get those minutes anyway. So overall, like this is one of the most well-rounded offenses in the NHL, and they're number six just because they lost that kind of one top end guy in Pavelski, but I think that's just gonna be a momentary loss. I really don't think it's gonna be something that's gonna affect this team throughout the entire season. I fully expect one of, if not more of those three young guys to be able to step up and cover that loss. Jumping to the blue line, it's a top 10 group. I have them ninth. Again, this is a group that I think got worse. I don't love Lyubushkin as like their seventh defenseman. I have him as the seventh D right now. But the conversation again has to start with Miro Heiskanen, who has really stepped up into being one of the best defensemen in the NHL. And he's somebody that it took a little bit to grow on me. I think the hype for Miro Heiskanen started like a year and a half too early. But But over the last, especially last season, he's really kind of taken that step into that top tier defenseman, right? I think it like, in a similar way to like how Noah Dobson and Evan Bouchard kind of really broke out this year. That's really where Miro Heiskanen grew on me. It was like the end of last year going into this season. And he's really developed into one of those like true top number one defensemen. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're even talking about him in the A plus tier by the end of the season. I'm not betting on it because moving up into the A plus is going to be very difficult for players just based on how my ratings work. But he's definitely like sniffing that group, and I think that's totally justified. You look at the other defensemen. Obviously, Thomas Harley was just signed, and again, just another very young defenseman who's offensive focused but can play defense as well. And that's really kind of the new modern age defenseman, which is weird because we saw this summer a lot of teams go after the bigger kind of stay at home defenseman. Even Dallas did that to some extent, bringing in guys like Matt Dumba and Ilya Lyubushkin. But I really think that the money's gonna be made with guys like Thomas Harley and your Miro Heiskanens. And again, Thomas Harley is somebody who I could easily see jumping up this year. I mean, Dallas is just so loaded with these younger kind of players, and they're a team that's going to be hovering around this Stanley Cup bubble for a number of years still, as long as things continue to go well. And it's going to be led by Heiskanen and Harley, and it's not just that they have these young players, but they have these young players. They're already a great team, and these young players are stepping up and taking these big roles, right? Like I mean, Heiskanen and Harley are the two best defensemen, and they're both still really young, so that bodes well for this team moving forward. You look at a guy like Esa Lindell too, whose contract when he signed it didn't look great, but he's kind of grown into it, and he just re-signed as well. I believe he just re-signed. Um, and as a third defenseman, he's somebody who's this kind of more your stay-at-home typical defenseman. He's not going to put up a ton of points, but he's a guy who you can kind of rely on to play those tougher defensive minutes, and that's how they used them last year. That's how I expect them to use them this year. You pair him with a guy like Nils Lundqvist, who the Stars kind of took a flyer on, and he was fine last year. I expect him to be a similar type of player. I don't really see him making the jump into being like a true second pair defenseman. I think that's kind of where this team lacks a little bit, is that they don't really have that fourth guy. They're just kind of like Lundqvist, Dumba, and Smith are all kind of guys you'd prefer to have on your bottom pair. If they could run a Dumba Lundqvist third pair and they could bring in a fourth defenseman, I think this team looks a lot better. That's kind of my one criticism of this blue line is I think you have your top three and your bottom three, and they need to be able to find a kind of somebody to bridge that gap, if that makes sense. And that's kind of my biggest concern with this blue line going forward. But even then, like I think your top three is good enough that they could make it work, right? Like it'll cover up a lot of those deficiencies, and deficiencies in the bottom three really aren't that bad, right? Like Brendan Smith being your sixth defenseman isn't bad. My concern is that this team's going to play Ilya Lyubushkin more than they will Nils Lundqvist. That's my one concern with this roster. And if that's the case, then that kind of opens up more opportunity for things to kind of go wrong on this blue line. But if this is the six that they run, it'll be a top 10 blue line in the NHL at the very least, as of right now. Finally, in net, this goaltending tandem's tied for fourth for me, and I might get some pushback on the Jake Oettinger rating, right? Like people fell in love with Jake Oettinger in the bubble, and rightfully so. He had a fantastic bubble playoffs. But other than that, like his regular season numbers haven't been great, and his playoff numbers have been better. But it's just finding that consistency throughout an 82 game schedule that separates him from, the Linus Ullmarks and the other goalies I've had kind of in that A minus tier. And if he can find that consistency and he can play like, a top 6-7 goal in the NHL over the course of a season, then I'll buy it, right? Like, but I'm going to get hot for a month and a half come playoff time is great, but it's very much an A minus type goaltender. And when we've talked with other A minus goaltenders, he fits that kind of description, right? Where it's like he's hot and cold throughout the regular season. He can turn it on for a couple weeks, and but you don't really know. You're not guaranteed to kind of know what you're going to get out of him night to night. It's very inconsistent. It's very in flux. That's what Jake Ottinger's been, and that's the biggest flaw for him. Now, in saying that, like he's a top 10 goalie in the NHL. Um, I'm not trying to bash the guy and say that he sucks, but obviously he's my third highest tier for goaltenders. But I feel like I might get some pushback for him not being an A. But it's just that consistency factor needs to be there. And if he can figure that out, then uh, things will things will be fine. And again, like he's a goal I definitely trust to be a starter. And I think Casey Smith's a good enough backup to kind of fill that role. He's been somebody who, especially when he was in Pittsburgh, looked like he could have taken the starting job from Tristan Jarry. And then, he was solid enough in Vancouver last year. I think he's definitely an upgrade uh, over what they had here in Scott Wedgwood. And obviously, I mean, they're tied for the fourth best goaltending tandem in the NHL with a couple other teams. I'm not concerned about this goalie tandem at all. Like, really, my biggest concern for this team is consistency in net. If Jake Ottinger can play a full season of being a high level elite goaltender, then that's fine. The blue line question marks below the top three. I guess you can say even top four because I think Matt Dumba is fine as like your four, maybe your fourth best defenseman if they can boost up the third pair. But I'd rather them go get another B minus type player. And offensively, I don't really have a ton of questions about the offense. It's just mostly development. But overall, I mean, Dallas is a team that uh, might be ranked lower than some people would have them currently. But I think when it comes to like projecting this team for the regular season and for the playoffs, I wouldn't be surprised if the end of the year we're looking at Dallas as the team that wins the cup. And like I said, I mean, Vegas onwards, everybody in this is in my cup window, but I think Dallas has some of the biggest potential for growth throughout this of this top group. And for a team that's already this good, that's kind of scary. So anyway, that is my thoughts on the Dallas Stars. Let me know what you think down below, and make sure you like and subscribe. And we're almost done. We're getting there. Um, regular or preseason's in full swing. Regular season starts October 4th. It's exciting. This is one of the best times of the year. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.